Welcome to today's webinar, Empowered or Enslaved, Media's Impact on Youth. This is episode 3 of our series on Youth at the Crossroads, featuring input from our Youth Advisory. At the KEI Network, we seek to challenge assumptions, especially those quietly shaping the minds of youth and the culture they inherit. Nowhere is this more urgent than in examining the double-edged sword of modern media. Today's media, both social and traditional, presents itself as a force for empowerment of youth. It gives voice to the marginalized, it challenges authority, it offers access to community. But increasingly, media does so placing blame squarely on the system, capitalism, government, institutions, while absolving individuals of responsibility. Youth are encouraged not to build resilience, but to protest and expect more, especially from government, while giving less thought to personal initiative or contribution. Now, this is an overview. It certainly doesn't apply to everyone, and that's the reason we want to hear from youth, is the extent to which this may apply generally or individually and specifically. At the same time, youth are bombarded by advertising like no generation before. Studies estimate that young people encounter thousands of ads daily. The numbers that I've seen in some of the research are up in the order of 4,000 to 10,000. It's hard to believe. From TikTok and YouTube to mobilized games, or to mobile games, and streaming apps. Most of these messages target their insecurities, suggesting that if they feel anxious, if they feel inadequate, if they feel excluded, a product or a service will fix it. They're being conditioned not to ask, what can I do, but what can be done for me? Today's webinar, Empowered or Enslaved, asks whether these platforms are helping youth find their voice or quietly training them to surrender it. Hence the topic, Empowered or Enslaved. So welcome. Joining us from the Youth Advisory today are Mikhail Paris, who is in place of Vivek, Rachel, and Emerson. And there's, of course, the audience itself that I'll call on later on for their input, commentary, and questions. So to get started, my first question of the Youth Advisory is, how have your personal experiences with social media shaped your own self-esteem or sense of belonging? So Rachel, I'm going to call on you first, and then I'll move to Mattel and then Emerson. How has your self-esteem been affected in any way by social media?
I think I've had positive and negative experiences personally, and if anything, I'm actually really glad you're bringing this up because I think that social media is oftentimes an under-accounted or under-considered reason for why millennials and Gen Z and Alpha have progressed the way that they have, being inside of a constant barrage of information. I think for me, the biggest upside or the biggest outcome was that it's made me a lot more careful and a lot more aware of what I say and when and to who and how. Um, and yeah, I think that being careful as a person because you could get canceled. And maybe even downstream of that, for me personally, starting to wonder, what opinions are worth getting canceled over? What beliefs do I hold so closely that even if I got canceled, I would be willing to say? And how important is it to me to be able to send that out there and take accountability for my viewpoint? I think that's been a huge part of how that's affected me.
Gotcha. Thank you. Very clear. Mikhail, you want to take a shot at this? How has social media affected you in any way?
I would say there's can you guys hear me? Just
Yeah.
asking for it. Yeah, okay. So I would say there's three main things that it's done. But I also want to take a look at what social media does in the first place. I would say one of the big things that social media does, it kind of shows you a mirror, but it's more of a distorted mirror. And one of the reasons people say this is because media shows you people who look like you, speak like you, and think like you. And that builds a sense of, I'm not alone, which gives a lot of representation to somebody and their own self. And when you see your culture and you see your voice or your hustle on screen, it affirms your worth. Now, I know a lot of people who may for example, be in countries where people who of their religion, of their ethnicity aren't actually around them. And so when they look at places like social media and they see things that they relate to, it does bring a sense of self-belonging. Now, for me personally, I would say one of the biggest things that I felt it's done is it's made things very shallow. I personally think that people's opinions and the way people like to express themselves has become very shallow, and it's been almost funneled into things like Instagram posts or just, hey, let me put a story up on something that I believe in. And it doesn't go any deeper than that. People just like the post, people just like the story, and it doesn't go any more than that. So I would say it depends on where you view, and some people may view it as, hey, I'm now seeing people who I've never seen before and people who I can actually relate to. But some may be like, I want to have deep conversations like we're having now about things I believe in, and I can't because everything is just so shallow. So that's in my opinion where it goes.
Okay, very good point. Shallow being a obvious feature of social media. Emerson, you want to jump in here?
I think I haven't posted on social media for a long time. Probably like 7, 8 years ago is the last time that I consistently posted on Facebook. And I was thinking about running in the recent general elections, and as part of that, I went and basically scrubbed my social media going back to high school, and saw between 20 to 25, I posted a lot, and was probably a pretty annoying person, to peers. And but at the time, on the self-esteem point, and to your point, Mikkel, people liking things, it's actually good for self-esteem. You post things, you have friends in a particular spot, they respond on it positively, and you feel better about yourself. Even if that's not really, the big thing that you're going for, you still get that validation. So it's probably a good thing in many ways, or it was a good thing for self-esteem, but maybe self-esteem isn't what you should be shooting for. Uh, so yes, it's good for self-esteem, but self-esteem is maybe not as good of a thing that people think it is.
Can I also
So that's yeah.
suggest that self-esteem that can be gained quickly and easily can be lost quickly and easily? And so that very rapid cycle of gaining it quickly and then having to keep it, it might not be self-esteem in the long run is the net effect. Great
It's like the
self-esteem in
whole
the long.
it's the whole short-term gratification dilemma that we're having, kind of like that.
Yes. Yeah, it's not self-esteem that's based on real value, based on real conviction. And this what goes to your point, Rachel, is as of about probably my mid to late 20s, I realized, oh, a lot of my views or some of my views are not shared by many friends. So if you post this online, like what my PhD supervisor was writing about at the time about cancellation of Jordan Peterson at the University of Cambridge, and just sharing that online, you're going to lose a lot of friends. So then you start to think about what you post. And in my case, the sense of belonging piece wasn't that, uh, well, that became less important to me. And I started posting a little bit more, but then I just realized it's better to stop posting because, when you post a lot, you just, you invite conversation that you just don't really want to have. So that led to uh, posting posting less in general. I just stopped overall as about probably 27, 28. So that's been my experience.
What I've seen is people showing off, creating a profile of themselves that they believe is characteristic of who they would like to be viewed as. And I'll admit myself, at my age, about the only thing I really wanted to brand was I took up baking. So the only thing I post on Facebook now is anytime I bake something interesting, I'll post it. And people find that unusual because they don't think of me as a baker. They think of me in my many other profiles. But it was sort of fun to learn baking and then share it with others that this is a hobby that I'm entertaining. So I suspect from a positive perspective, you can shape your brand and shape your image by what you put out there, that whether that be positive and truly characteristic of yourself or just something that you want to share with others. Okay, on to the next question. Can you
Oh,
describe a
hey
book?
Barry. Mrs. Michael here. I'm here as
Oh,
well
Michael.
today. So,
Oh, sorry, Michael. I
yeah,
missed
no
your turn.
worries.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I got a little bit to say about that as well.
Go ahead.
So social media has, definitely shaped my self-esteem in many different ways, especially growing up, as a young person and being born into a generation of social media. I often found myself comparing my life to what I saw others sharing, especially people like influencers and celebrities. And That used to make me wish, I could live like them. And over time, that constant comparison began to chip away at my self-worth. I felt like sometimes I wasn't enough with the constant comparing. But, as I grew older and, was able to still live life a little bit more and grow up, I started to realize that, I'm exactly who I'm meant to be. I began to, appreciate the life I've been given and, understand that my story, my background, my culture are a part of what makes me unique. Instead of comparing myself to others, I started to look at them as, inspirations and people I can look up to, not something to compete with, but, something to learn from. Now, I use social media not as a place to judge myself, but as a platform to express who I truly am. It's become, a space where I can celebrate my identity, advocate for Indigenous voices, and share a message I believe in. Um, from the shift from comparison to purpose completely, changed how I see myself. And yeah, that's kind of what I had to say about that.
That's a very interesting transition of Facebook as an expression of yourself, and then
Mm,
secondly, as a community and learning who is your community and how to build that community. So interesting dichotomy between the person and the public. Okay, second question. Can you describe a moment? And I'll start out with you, Michael. Can you describe a moment when you questioned something you saw online? We hear a lot about misinformation. How did you verify the truth if you did so before reacting or sharing it?
yeah, for sure. I'll talk about something that, hit a little bit close to home. And one, often piece of misinformation I often seen on social media is the myth that residential schools were a long time ago and that Indigenous people should get over it. That kind of rhetoric has become more common in recent years, especially as Canada begins to more publicly engage with truth and reconciliation. But the truth is, I didn't have to look it up. I lived it. I carry the weight of generation trauma, as does my family, and so does many of my friends who I grew up with in Frog Lake.
Mhm.
The trauma from residential schools didn't disappear when the buildings closed. It shaped homes where love, sobriety, happiness, and even cultural identity were taken or forgotten. Many Indigenous families were left without the tools to pass those things on, and instead, the trauma was passed down. The last residential school in Canada was closed in 1997. That's within many of our lifetimes. It's not, ancient history. It's a present day reality that still affects our communities in deep and lasting ways. When I see people spreading that kind of misinformation, I speak from lived experiences. I believe it's crucial that Canadians understand that this isn't something we can just move on from. Healing takes time, resources, and real understanding. Truth and reconciliation can't happen without acknowledging the full truth and continuing to support Indigenous peoples and rebuilding what was stolen.
Okay, so when you saw information on the internet that questioned, you had your own personal experience and those of your own community to challenge. Uh,
Yes.
Emerson, what about you?
So the question is things that made me question what I read online.
Right.
I think this is very anecdotal, but when I was in the UK, I would talk with certain friends that were going through a potential breakup that eventually did break up, and right before they broke up, they would post these long things online about how much they liked their girlfriend, and they'd be these really long, multi-paragraph posts with really nice photos, like I'm so grateful to be with so and so, and then I'm thinking, Logan, we were just talking about how you're not liking how things are going, and you've got your sort of breakup text, all written out, like, or like, not a text, but something written out on your phone that you're going to deliver in person. And I just saw this happen so much with people that would be posting online about their significant others, and then they broke up shortly thereafter. So that just made me think sometimes, what you read online, people can, oftentimes, if somebody's presenting their life or partner or something as being very good, I tend to believe the opposite. And I just learned those through those handful of examples when it came to romantic relationships with friends that you've got to really take for granted what people are posting, especially if they're posting something that's really emotive about some aspect of their personal life, because maybe they're trying to make up for something. Maybe they're trying to convince themselves that something is different than it is. Who knows why people, post in certain ways. But I saw that happen enough that I thought, okay, this is just something worth paying attention to. And you've got to look at what people post about certain aspects of their life with a grain of salt, if not believe the opposite. Because when things are going well, you probably don't need to be posting about things as much.
So just being a contrarian gave you some insights that you've had then verified through your real experience. Rachel, yourself.
I think for me, my experience has more come from following a lot of different like news sources and personalities and finding a lot of news online. And in that case, I think I do have the benefit of not being a journalist, so racing to break the story first isn't what I'm trying to do. However, I think a lot of certain elements and ways of verifying things have come out for me. One of them is just consensus. If you're looking across and you find a really crazy news story, can you find multiple news stories that are more or less saying the same thing? And that's a quick check away. That's just a really easy way for me to say, okay, does this seem verifiable? And another one is primary sources. I mean, you don't often have the time to go to a primary source, but sometimes if you think it's going to be short, if it's an interesting court opinion that you want to read because you're interested in what the decision came out as, I find myself doing that when I can. And I do think that I think even we've had some bills in Canada about news sources and what can be shown online. I think that taking away the convenience of getting to primary sources or getting to specific news sources is a negative thing because it prevents you from doing your own investigation in the area where it's most convenient to you. And then the other thing that I kind of learned, more so from an engineering perspective, is in engineering, you do a lot of really complex calculations and you do math and you have to do physics and apply, vector calculations. And at the end of the day, the very last thing you should do before you submit your answer or to say, yeah, we're going with this is, does this answer make sense? Does this make sense to me as a person? And I think that, in the comments, Yutong brought up a really good point, which is critical thinking. And one of the biggest problems that I do see with social media is that I don't think you're not doing any critical thinking. If you look at somebody else's opinion, you don't realize that what you're looking at is an opinion and you're taking that as truth first. You don't get a chance to apply what do I think about this piece of information to the information. And I think that not building that skill is it's a poor way to go about life, and it's a difficult way to sort of learn about yourself and build resilient ways of thinking. So that is kind of one of the downsides. I try to mitigate with the other things.
I think that plays into one of the concerns that I've had over the course of my life is media at one point was about news and it presented news. It tried to do so in an unbiased manner, if that's at all possible. But of late, there's hardly an article I can read that is not really the statement of an opinion. And in order to make the story more interesting, they will personalize the event by portraying how a person has been affected, which plays into the victim. And the media then playing out the story that some system has broken down and this individual is suffering. If government would only do things differently, if capitalism would only behave with more sensitivity, if the institution was only more gracious. And so we're constantly being bombarded by information through the media, personalizing a story in the interest of advancing society, if you will, and making it more socially responsive. But for those that weren't here 50, 60, 80 years ago when I was first being exposed to news, it's changed dramatically. Mikkel, you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I think I have two main things to add. And I'm kind of gonna add on to Rachel's point for the first thing is that I think one of the biggest things that we should be watching out for is who is the person giving this information and what are they trying to make you think? I think one of the biggest things that we see a lot is that right now that social media is like an attention war. It's like a war fighting for your attention. And a lot of the time when, for example, I'm gonna pull a big guy here, but like Trump says like pulls out this big social media post, generally it's not what is he saying, but it's what is he trying to make you think, what reaction is he trying to get out of you. And you see that even with his big political moves outside, but that's not really where we're going. My point is that it's a lot with what are they trying to make you, what are they trying to make you think. Now I think the second big thing for me is that this is going kind of back to the attention war. People are fighting for your dopamine, especially people my age. I'm probably the youngest person here. I'm 16. And so I think one of the biggest things I see in my own generation and the people around me is that everyone's scrolling reels, everyone's always on TikTok, and the information that you get may not be true, but it'll be the information that'll get the best reaction out of you. And now, well, there's two main things that happen here. One of the big things, and this is the first thing I see, is people taking information out of context to appeal to you. For example, I don't know what it was, but recently there was a bill passed, and I think it was something about Mamdani, the guy who's about to be elected as mayor in New York. And they took something he said and they said, wow, look at what he's doing, he's imposing socialist policies, he's a socialist, he may even be a communist. And it was ridiculous. And so people were using that information and not giving the full context just so they could get the dopamine now, or kind of get your attention. Now the second piece, and I see this a lot, is just blatant lying. So I can give a recent example to this. I'm Muslim, and one of the big things that I see is people talking about theology and making posts, for example, even about Christianity or even about Islam or Judaism, and saying things that are frankly untrue. In Islam, we believe in this thing called Sunnah, which is the acts and the words of the Prophet. And people would say, "Oh yeah, this is a Sunnah of the Prophet," and I would search it up later, and there's nothing online anywhere about it even being real. And so what they're really trying to, oh, and by the way, that post that I'm talking about had 15 million views. And so I just want you to think about it. 15 million people went and they were probably like, wow, he said to do this, I'm going to do it. And then they didn't realize that it was just completely untrue and it was a blatant lie. So I'd say that is one of the biggest, those are the 2 to 3 main things that I personally feel and see.
Oh, it's very, the whole area of the role that authority plays, whether it be religious or political, in trying to convey a message is in itself how authority plays a role in terms of implying truth, whereas in reality it may just be a source of misinformation. I've even seen there was an ad. I don't know how many of you have seen it, Elon Musk talking about a new investment strategy in Canada. It looks very legitimate. And, I listened to it and I thought, this can't possibly be real. And I don't know where it came from. I don't know why it hasn't been taken down, but incredibly realistic. And I'm sure people got sucked in. I see you nodding your head, Mikhail. Are you aware of that ad? Yeah, bizarre.
And
Um,
me and Vivek were talking about it for a good 15-20 minutes. Yeah.
It's crazy. I'm going to jump past the questions that relate to what strategies you use, because I think each of you have touched on that to some extent. Uh, Critical thinking, conferring with friends, life experience. And I'm going to jump right to the question of what changes would you like to see from platforms, educators, or policymakers to better support youth's digital resilience and media literacy. So we're talking here about an environment, some of which is negative and implying that change would be in order. And there certainly have been efforts to regulate for young people their exposure and access to social media. But I'd like your views. Emerson, you want to start off here? What do you think we should do? And any other viewpoints you might want to share. Touched on.
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, and I probably don't have as many opinions or thoughts as others in this call. I mean, I've sometimes thought maybe limiting hours that youth can spend on social media is a good idea. Just be, I mean, especially at a really young age, if you're under under 16 or even younger, that might be worth doing. I mean, that's the main thought that that comes to mind. But I'd be really curious for what others think on this side. And I mean, the other thing I'd add is there's a bit of a trade-off between, freedom of speech on the one hand, and I guess limitation of what people can access uh, te- technologically on the other. But from what I've heard, these technologies really work people's brains at a young age. So maybe, and that even tech leaders in the states don't allow their kids to spend that much time on social media because they know how harmful it can be. So maybe it's best to find ways to limit how much young people can actually spend on social media.
And I mean, I also don't think it's just up to policy in this particular case. I think parents play a big role in how their kids interact with media. I think that a lot of the policy efforts that attempt to speak to both free speech and keeping children safe are things that kids can just work around really easily. Like, is a 12-year-old going to check a box to say, yes, I'm 13 and I can access this? Sure. In a lot of cases, they can just do that quite simply. So I think that, one of the things, for example, um, growing up over time, um, actually a really good example of this is just consensus. Like Perry, sometimes you talk about markets and how they work and how they will tend to correct themselves in a certain way. So for example, one of the things that's come up a lot in across YouTube from the time that I was younger in my teenage years and that I start using it now is the practice of covering a kid's face if they're under a certain age and they're in a video. That never used to be a thing, but with so many of the things that have come out now, a lot of creators will just be called out by their own audience if they have their kids on social media too much or if they're not dealing with their kids in a protective way. So having sort of a community of people who are trying to behave responsibly and who will call out certain behaviors, I think not from a legislative perspective, but from a community perspective, goes a long way.
That's fascinating. I couldn't agree more. Michael, you want to add anything here?
Yeah, sure. I guess one of the biggest challenges I like to see is, stronger action against misinformation on social media. A lot of the times it's kind of left unchecked and sometimes it goes very viral, like, mentioned earlier, 15 million views on misinformation or an Elon Musk ad about Canada that wasn't true. While, I fully believe in freedom of speech, I also believe that when false information spreads, especially when it causes harm or divides communities, platforms have a responsibility to step in. I know misinformation that fuels hate, fear, or denial of truth should not be allowed to stay online unchecked. I think, some ways that we can look into getting rid of some of that misinformation is to explore more serious tools to prevent that, like requiring some form of identity or background verification before people can post or comment, as just a thought off the top of the head. Especially to reduce the number of internet trolls and anonymous accounts spreading harmful content. It's not about silencing voices, but about making people more accountable for the things that they say online. Just like if they were to say that in person, I'm sure that, a lot of times it'd be consequences. But now that it's online, sometimes people, are wearing a mask and they feel like they can do or say whatever they want, which, they need to be accountable for, especially when it's not right. I guess another issue that, doesn't get enough attention is the age restrictions on social media. I know we talked a little bit about, the youth in social media, but, a lot of these platforms were built for adults, yet we see very young kids using them daily. I mean, the impact it has on the developing mind is huge. I think it's important that we enforce age limits more seriously and also give young people time to grow, think critically, develop their own worldview before being exposed to the overwhelming and usually toxic environment that social media can sometimes be. I think that if we want to build digital resilience in youth, we need support not just from platforms, but from educators, policymakers, and as well as mentioned by Rachel, families. That means, better media literacy education in schools, stronger protections on platforms, and open conversations at home about, how to navigate the digital world and safely and consciously, because, it's a dangerous place now on social media, and a lot of youth don't really know what they're getting themselves into. So I think it's important to start having those conversations early with your young youth in your home, or other youth that may look up to you. I think it's really important. But yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
leave it at that.
Well, you've touched on a number of things, several of which I hope we can explore further. And one of them is the role of parents, and the second on accountability. It's hard to know how you can introduce accountability in this system. The telephone has existed now for a century, and nobody is censoring what goes on in the telephone. And yet, with the video component, we have become highly sensitive to what the content is. Michaela, you want to add anything further and wrap the advisory panel session up?
Sure. I have a couple things to say, so sorry, this might be a little lengthy. But I think one of the first things that I would talk about is probably one of the things that what sorry, what is your name? It was Emerson said. Emerson was talking about, maybe we keep people off of social media for a while, or people who are underneath, we limit their hours. Now, while I do think that can be useful, one of the big things that happens with people my generation and my age is that social media has turned into a way to communicate and improve your social health. There's mental health, there's physical health, and there's also social health. And many people, even my parents, would argue, hey, you're socializing with somebody online, that doesn't really help you. You got to go meet them in person. While many people in our generation, and honestly, many psychologists even disagree. What they would say is, they would say, actually, youth do need time on social media because it's now been used as a way to communicate with their friends, communicate with other people, and it's a huge, huge thing that helps improve their social health. Now, one of the big things that we see is we also see this thing with Instagram, where people will basically, oh, okay, yeah. So one of the big things that happened with Instagram is that people started taking down things that they didn't like. Instagram basically said, hey, we have a team of like this many people, and every time they see something that is reported, it'll be taken down because it's inappropriate. What started happening is that people who disagreed with something that was entirely opinion based and was not really a fact anymore would be taken down. For example, people wanted to go, and during the elections, there'd be a bunch of pro-Trump posts or pro-Kamala Harris posts, and what Instagram would do is they would get a bunch of these reports on the Trump posts, even though people are just making their support for it, and it would get taken down, even though it didn't say anything inherently wrong. Now, that's an issue because that's, limiting free speech, and that's limiting expression. And that's one of the big things I see. And yeah, now one of the big things that we talked about is how can we, oh yeah, no, that was good. And then how can we limit the amount people see like bad stuff, and how can we improve media literacy? I think parents is definitely a way to go with it. Um, However, I think the apps themselves should also be educating. And the apps themselves should also be giving freedom. Now, that's really hard to say because how are you educating people and also giving them freedom? But really, let's be honest, like people and our brains really don't like the negative. So there was this study done where basically people were like, it was like people can't really inherently think negative. If you say don't think about elephants, all of you guys just thought about elephants, right? And so what will happen is that if you go on Instagram and you say, hey, don't post violent things, don't post these things, people will start doing more of it. There was recently this thing on May the 1st where Reddit said, hey, we're going to ban everything that's inappropriate. And then people went and they hoarded the internet with violent posts of people beating each other, and it was ridiculous. It was genuinely insanity because they were putting out the most gruesome stuff that's ever been put on the internet just because they didn't like hearing that negative. So I think what we need to do is we need to educate people and be like, hey, here is the stuff that is bad, and then from there give them the freedom to put the bad stuff down itself, right? If people all think inherently, if people all say, hey, this gruesome violent posts are bad, people will say bad things about it and they will get taken down, but people need their own freedom to be able to do that. Now, I think one of the biggest ways that we can get rid of, maybe these more lack of productivity and stuff like that is actually by changing what the FODs and the trends actually are. Um, I don't know if you guys know, but there's these trends called, like, for example, height maxing or gym maxing, where basically what it means is that you'll take a certain aspect of your life or a certain aspect of life and you'll say, hey, I'm going to max it out. I'm going to go to the gym every single day. I'm going to do this all the time and I'm going to go extremely heavy on it. I think what we can do is that we can start making things like hope core, which is basically like, including posts where people feel more hopeful instead of depressed, and having things like health maxing or grass maxing. That was a huge thing that actually happened recently, where people would call it grass maxing, which would mean get off your phone and go touch grass, which means go outside. And what that did is actually statistically in that year, for those 3 months where grass maxing and health maxing was a huge FOD and a trend, the amount of people on the internet all went down by, I think it was around 20 to 35%, which is ridiculous, especially people my age. People our age went out by 40%, and they would go meet with their friends under this huge term called health maxing or social maxing. And I think so. What I really think it is that it's about what you're making people see and what you're making cool, right? If you're making, May the 1st, let's go put out all these gruesome posts really cool, then obviously it's not going to be helpful. But if you're going to put out these things like health maxing, gym maxing, and things that are inherently positive, the internet will become inherently positive. And so that's kind of my take on it.
All right, thank you. A question did come to mind that maybe I can ask the panel for their input on it. Almost at no point was the word education used in the course of this discussion. I think it was mentioned once. I think Michael mentioned educators, but that was it. We have libraries in schools with the introduction of books. We have the opportunity in school to introduce children to the value of books, what's in books, how to read well, how to comprehend. I don't know of any school that is teaching kids today how to use the internet as a source of research, as a source of social communication, as a source of community building. It would seem to me that we have a tool that is being used by every child, and yet no schooling, education, or learning going on about that. It's not a tool that parents are particularly familiar with, or if it is, for very different reasons. What are your views on the relevance of introducing curriculum in the school system about using social pressures and social measures as an educational option for teaching kids proper etiquette in the usage of social media? Rachel, what do you think?
Oof. Well, I think, like this discussion was also had about, sex education in school at one point in time and whether or not it was effective to introduce legislation, that brought that education into the school. I think that you get this effect where, if I understand youth correctly, you can kind of make fun of that more than anything else. It kind of becomes a me versus the system, the youthful mind versus the traditional mindset on that. And on top of that, I think that kids are going to learn from experience on social media and come to their own conclusions regardless. And I think that's why for me, which is not to say that I don't think that, acknowledging the fact that you should teach kids to be safe on the internet, I would definitely say that that's a good thing in some generic sense. I just don't think that it would have the long-term effect of being as effective as another solution for actually keeping people safe. I think it's a necessary, yes, we are telling you how to do this, and for the sake that and some people might just never come to these conclusions. But things like, and one of the things, again, in terms of market solutions that I was thinking of is making making information that doesn't cite its source just feel less credible. So if you gain a standard that says, hey, people who have cited their sources are more likely to have credible information, people who are posting quickly are not, kind of to McCall's point, if that's the kind of standard that you can introduce, if that's the kind of thing that you as the consumer say, I have a preference for, and you start to behave like that, and you start to post that, in the spirit of McCall, I'll go on at just a slight amount of length about it. But you had a question about being drawn into echo chambers. And I think the point is, if echo chambers and sensationalist areas have a temperature, your job in that can be to bring the temperature down. Your job in that can be as simple as to say, hey, post, I'm not sure about the source of this information. I'm going to go look for something with better sources. And then don't engage with it again. That's your signal to the creator, not that you're choosing not to participate in the system by saying, I'm not going to engage with this right now. I'm going to prefer content that has a higher quality. And that is something that you as an individual, without becoming an influencer, without doing anything else, can do to improve not just your experience with the media, but maybe even everybody else's.
And that point that you've just made is one that could be introduced in schools. I mean, teaching critical thinking is possible. And I'm not denying that individual expression and individual behavior will go beyond what goes on in the classroom, just as it does with what they read and what they do in their lives. But school does provide some reference point in a social context where children can learn from one another and from an instructor on what may or may not be the consequences of their behavior on others. Emerson, you want to add anything here?
My addition would be, I think critical thinking focused pedagogy would have worked maybe 10 or 20 years ago. But increasingly, I just don't trust teachers. Things have become so politicized that, to me, if there's curricula introduced on critical thinking, it's, critical thinking is my way of thinking. That's the challenge. Anything that's not quote unquote conservative is a form of critical thinking. So that's my concern, is that these are things that should take place, or that could be in formal education settings, but those types of institutions have in large part degraded or have become really political. So we can't trust that teachers are going to implement this effectively. So then my thought goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is more informal sources of education, i.e., what can parents do? But then how do you help your kids get around, or how do you work with your kids to help them understand these challenges? Because, well, you just can't, you can't police what your kids are doing 24/7.
But Emerson, you're quite correct in your views of whether we can trust what schools do is going to be in the interest of the kids or some ideology. But how do you teach parents to parent?
I'm not sure. I mean, that's another challenge. Also in a social media age. I mean, yeah, that could be a whole different conversation.
I mean, I agree that that's hard. That's one of the biggest challenges that I have, is that you kind of see this bifurcation between people who respond to the challenge of social media by saying, I will improve this for myself and my kids, and people who have no interest in doing that. And then their kids are kind of left they're on their own for, are they going to become mentally well, mentally challenged? Is it going to be hard for them on social media, et cetera? Are they going to have downstream bad effects? And I think that that's why, gosh, I keep hammering this, but why I think like a consensus-based community approach is better, because you're learning from the environment what the environment expects. I might never tell a kid that when they grow up to the age of 18, and if they have a kid, that they should cover the kid's face because there are crazy people out there who could try to track a kid down and it's not safe. But if they see everybody else doing it, you've effectively introduced a persistent long-term standard that can potentially have more effect, that is more impervious to being made fun of and being, oh, this was handed down to me by a teacher. You've incredibly raised the standard on and eliminated a certain amount of bad just by creating this community guideline. But again, I would also toss in that's not particularly easy to do. Rallying your community around that, it's a slower process of change than legislation, for sure.
Well, just building on that. Well, just one thing really quickly. A solution to me, it's funding local community real life initiatives, uh, like churches, local community groups, sports teams, things like that. It's informal types of education that give people access to a wide range of life experiences that can help people to become critical thinkers. And critical thinking is just, as my former PhD supervisor used to say, how's that different than just thinking? You know, critical thinking it's just thinking based on life experience. But my bias on this is towards informal, local community experiences rather than formal education or government type uh, solutions.
Well, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So, how to introduce marketing for parents so that parents see this of value to their kids and want themselves to become educated and to join one of these groups so they can do a better job and or send their kids off to these sessions so that's what private schools are trying to do today is break the curriculum ideology. Michael Marty, you want to add anything here? And then I'll ask Mikkel.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. I just like to say that I think it's definitely a good idea, not putting it into school and the schooling system and the curriculum, but doing things like workshops or, even online groups like this one we have here where you're able to talk about, important things like your digital footprint, and what that means is, everything that you post on, social media or online is always going to be around, even if you delete it. Those are still, up there in the web. And I know there's a lot of um, people like hackers who could, easily get access to those things. So I still think it's, it's important to be able to educate people on that, especially on, things like I know it's become pretty consistent now is, catfishes and young people getting catfish or manipulated by older people through social media. I still think, there's still a lot of dangers to it and a lot of things that could be, educated, especially in terms of safety, especially for the youth, because I think, they're the ones that are most at risk when it comes to it. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So,
And
Michael, I'm going to ask you a personal question. I mean, my biases are you're out at Frog Lake, you're on a reserve, internet access is there, it's today. You're clearly pretty well informed on a number of these issues. Where did you get your education to become so contemporary in your perspectives on these matters?
I guess a lot of it, as I mentioned earlier, is just, living my life and, seeing these things. I've witnessed friends and families experience things like, catfishes and, a lot of my education once I moved off the reservation. So when I went to college and when I went out to the real world, I experienced a lot of these things in person. And that's where I learned a lot of these things, as well as, just doing my research online and, reading blogs or watching news articles about some of the things that happen in our world, especially when it comes to our new social media landscape.
Okay, well, what's obvious? I mean, today, and I'm sure this is a takeaway for anybody who's watching this, is that our youth are well aware that social media and media itself are not in themselves ideal, that there are a number of issues that one needs to be personally responsible and not just passive in accepting what information and the processes associated with usage of social media. So that in itself is insightful and healthy. That we're not youth are not naive to the relevance of social media. Mikkel, you're going to get the last word on this one.
Um, I don't think I think honestly all the opinions and stuff like that has been covered. But one thing I wanted to go back to was something you asked Emerson, which was how do we get parents to actually, talk about this? And this is kind of an idea I had, and I don't know how successful it would be. And we talked about this before. Rachel even mentioned it as well. If you say something in school, kids won't want to do it. And it's like they generally try and go against it and they try and make it a joke of it. But when people see something in the forms of things like entertainment, they get really, really fascinated by it and they love to, participate in something they see that is generally entertaining. An example of this before I go into kind of the idea would be, for example, something like MasterChef. Um, MasterChef, when it came out during a time where, yeah, people cooked, but they didn't have a passion for it. They'd really do it just to survive. And when MasterChef came out over the years now, it's gotten even more popular and it's actually increased a huge, huge trend around media and eating and media and food and cooking and stuff like that. Recipes come out and you see all these different things and people love it. I think for me, one of the biggest ideas, and I've thought about this and I've actually discussed this with Vivek, is what would happen if there was, maybe the creation of some kind of game show where you showed parents and kids flipping the switch and then showing parents or showing kids what it's like uh when all this stuff happens, so showing it from their perspective on, if you imagine your parents being addicted, imagine your parents, all this stuff happening to your parents. And maybe I don't really know like a specific design because I'm not a director for film, but what I can tell you is that if we create something entertaining or some kind of movie show or TV show where it basically the end of like it's entertaining to people, but the end of the line or the end goal is to show that, hey, kids maybe need to go off of devices and need to go off of gadgets, that will definitely create a huge thought and trend around actually taking people off of the internet. And I think it's a really, really interesting idea, and it's something that I've also thought about in my life. As for something that I just wanted to mention before I end this off is that yeah, I would say devices are like, keeping your kids off devices is definitely good, especially at early ages. Me as an example, my mom didn't let me get on the internet or even watch TV while I was at the doctor's office until I was around the age of 7 or 8. And that was really when I was actually forced to use computers for work in class. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that actually has helped me because that got me really into reading, that got me really into news, and that got me really into actually learning a lot of the stuff that I do today. So yeah, just wanted to
Well,
mention that.
thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna ask Yitong. Yitong's communicated on the chat a number of perspectives. Yitong, share with us your overall perspective of on this topic. What you've been sharing with us on your chat, if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. So I think the biggest thing is to just focusing on the long-term results. So understanding the intrinsic values and like keep being motivated. So yeah, basically I personally like learned a lot of things from like books or like some articles with deep analysis. So I think it's always good to kind of like start to like reading those historical books and kind of like reading those articles with deep analysis. So I think like it's good to have those kind of habits from when you are young. So I think that's also something that would actually separate the top 1%, the richest family, to just the middle class families. So basically, like if you kind of like look at those examples from those richest families, so they always encourage their kids to read books with very in-depth um, historical events or those kind of stuff. So that's how they kind of like educated their kids, and basically, and yeah, so that's why they always retain their top 1% in the society. So basically, they won't really like have a chance to let their kids to get back to the middle class. I think that's something kind of like something I kind of figure out throughout the well in the recent years. I mean, so yeah. I'm personally a Gen Z, so there are like a lot of things I don't really see that well. So there are like some gaps that I have in my knowledge, but yeah, this is kind of my overall view. So a lot of things can be wrong because there are like a lot of things I'm not really smart or familiar with. But yeah, this is kind of like my general opinion. So
Well, it seemed to me one of the defenses that has become pretty obvious in our discussion of the misuse of social media and the avoidance of abuse is to ensure you have a breadth of life experience. that you're not living in the virtual world of the internet. You're not living in the virtual world of social media or Facebook. That your own identity needs to be shaped by more than what you learn and share online. And it would seem to me what the concern that we have is that youth live too narrow a life and get sucked into this in the belief that this is reality, whereas it is only one dimension of reality. It is reality. I mean, you can't deny that. But if an individual, young child in particular, is drawn into all of the excitement of what is shared on the internet and the belief that this is reality, that therein lies the problem.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah, basically, like I believe that if you want to avoid that from happening, you need to like read more stuff. And I personally believe that there are like some individuals do share things that are closely aligned to the reality, but you have to just dig into it. And then, yeah, so whenever you approach something, you have to know whether they are sharing for fun or they are just sharing for some personal interest or what. So yeah, so you have to just dig into it very hard, and then there are certain perspectives that are very very kind of like close to reality, but yeah, there are also things that are like deviate a lot from reality. So but you have to filter that out like based on your knowledge, right? You have to experience a lot of stuff in your life, and you have to read a lot of books and articles. So I think that's something more important, and you have to do like a lot of critical thinking. Sometimes I do critical thinkings like 3 or 4 hours per day. So if I'm not really like doing any work, so I would typically do critical thinkings 2 or 3 hours a day at least. So yeah, that's something I would suggest like most people to do if they want to kind of like avoid getting influenced by social media.
Okay, well, thank you, Yitong. We are at wrap up. I'm going to go around the table and just see if there's any hands up from the general audience of any additional comments, Randall or Yogi or whomever, Stephen. If not, Yogi, yeah, go ahead.
So kind of a high level theme that I think about is that as knowledge advances and every discipline becomes more complex and the number of disciplines that exist keeps going up, it becomes increasingly difficult for anyone to have a reasonable understanding of many topics or many themes or many disciplines. And I like what Jitong said about needing to do a little research before you reply to a social media post. And I encourage everyone to make sure that you don't forward anything or reply to anything that you don't have at least some sense that it's accurate, because the algorithm means the more engagement that we provide, the more the misleading, the hate, the bizarre theories are spread around. So I think it's our responsibility to not participate in that.
This is excellent point, Yogi, and I think this will play well into the next session where we get into AI. What I interpret you saying is even in usage of social media or media in general, ask questions. But in order to ask the right question, you've got to do a little bit of homework beforehand to make sure that you're asking a question that is really relevant to the point that you're seeking. Some people are very superficial, and what they
Yeah.
come back is very superficial answers.
And it's so easy to be misled. And
Yeah.
also, you might be posting nonsense, not because you intend to, but simply your own lack of knowledge.
Well, and this is back to Emerson's early comment. It's come up numerous times. Critical thinking really is thinking, asking questions, probing, not being so ready to accept the superficiality of what you get in social media. Jeff, you want to add anything here?
I was just thinking about your comment earlier about how you saw an ad with Elon Musk promoting such and such. And that's a perfect example of what we're seeing with deep fakes, AI generated information. So I've seen similar stuff with Oprah. I've seen stuff where Mark Carney's being used. And what shocks me is that there's no legislation or no internal policing on from like YouTube or the platforms that are selling these ads to actually confirm that this is real or legitimate, or they have the right to use somebody's image or any of these things. And it's a, I don't know, I think in the States right now it's a very dangerous, or around the world really, it's a dangerous thing because precedents are being set with artificial intelligence being able to take people's creative materials without giving them any compensation or even acknowledging that their database was built on these other people's work. And it's very as a creative person myself, it's frustrating to see that. One other point that I wanted to make was there was some mention about the top 1% don't allow their children to watch videos and stuff. And I would say yes, there are a lot of people that are who are aware of the dangers, and they don't allow their children to watch or participate in social media. And our family is certainly in that situation. We have my daughter's entering grade 12 this year, and we haven't let her go on social media yet because we've heard so many horrible stories about the negative effects that it can have on their development and self-image and so forth. So it's not that all of the top 1% are doing. I'm certainly not in the top 1% of wage earners or wealthy people. I would say it's a distribution. Everybody's an individual, and we all have our own perspectives on the world. We all have our own experiences. So it's very dangerous to generalize in that way. And like even among poorer people, there in this day and age with the internet, we have the opportunity to learn and better ourselves so that they can keep their children from being exposed to these things if they learn about the dangers and so forth. Anyway, I don't want to take too much time on this.
Well, I think as wrap up, I think it's quite obvious that there are risks of being exposed to information. Social media provides a whole array of information, personal and otherwise, that can have an impact on a developing child. We start with parenting and the role that parents play in helping to shape the development of a child. And we would hope, and I underscore that four-letter word hope, that parents would be more responsible in the raising of their children and the exposure they get to anything, whether it be in books or social media. At the public level, we're concerned at the slow rate at which the public has been able to regulate the excesses of free expression, because there is such a thing as an excess and a limit to free expression, whether it be promoting terrorism or sexism or whatever you might have. So
Bitcoin.
from the personal and the public perspective, I think we've heard a whole array of discussion today of the risks and the opportunities, and comforted that youth are well aware that there are risks and are engaged in critical thinking. At least our advisory panel. Shirley, you've got your hand up.
I had a question for our guests today. I think as Mikhail mentioned, making things entertaining. For example, I think it was MasterChef that you used. What is your perception of all the competition? Not only is sports competitive, but a lot of things that you see on TV, such as cooking, pottery, even dating has become competitive. And also getting an education is competitive. What is your view on what that means for your age group and the future? How do you perceive this in a positive way or negative way?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and it's a good question. It's actually extremely important. You even mentioned things like schooling and the colleges. There's people called Limmy. There's a guy named Limmy Talks actually on the internet where he basically goes over the best of the best and their college applications, and it makes people feel very very unimportant. I would say competition, in my opinion, in my experience, has been very positive. I would say for me, it's given me a lot of ambition in everywhere I go. I think like I like the idea of seeing the best of the best or people, really good doing things because for me, it makes me want to be better. And it really feeds my ambition. Now, for other people, and I have many friends like this, they don't see this as a positive thing. Um, people actually feel very, very, almost like they feel I don't know how to put it, like rock bottom, I guess, in the sense that they feel like they can't do anything without being compared to or anything. They're afraid of failing. And so I think there's really two views on it would be of course there's more in the middle ground, but the two extremists would be people like me who really, really take it and feed off it as ambition, and people who look at it and they're like, I'm too afraid to fail because everything is a competition. And it also affects things like you talked about dating. Yeah, it brings a lot of toxic trends and a lot of toxic behaviors. And yeah, I could go on for this for hours, but yeah.
Well, we talked last week about coddling and overprotection and the implications on youth and retarding their development. So it's a delicate balance. If this was an easy question to address, we wouldn't be featuring it on the webinar. But clearly, society is being confronted, its institutions, its educational systems, its government, with this new tool called social media and media in general that has moved to become an instrument that has risks associated with it that we have not had to grapple with before. So I thank you all, the audience and the advisory in particular, for your thoughtful input on the topic.